Got yourself a 3D printer but don't know what to make? Well, here are 6 awesome 3D printed projects ranging from simple to advanced. This video is basically a sequel because quite some time ago I released part 1, which is linked in the video description. Today I'm back with another 6, and they are projects rather than just individual items to print. So let's jump in. Firstly, we have yet another modular storage system by WeekdayWeekend. There's lots of designs like this about, but this one's a great one. The first thing to know is that the creator Adam is one of my patrons and has a YouTube channel called WeekdayWeekend. Previously, I covered these training models from Too Tall Toby. They're a great way to hone your skills in 3D modeling, but unfortunately they're no longer free. So Adam has taken it upon himself to build up a free alternative. It's got much the same layout as the original, lots of different parts to learn lots of different techniques. Starting the timer gives you a technical drawing to work from. You can just model these in your own time, or if you like, input the mass and go onto the leaderboard. It's completely free, as is this storage project. Let's categorize it. The 3D printing and assembly is simple, and the only non-printed parts you'll need are self-tapping screws. Lower down the page on printables, we can see that we have a great description and step-by-step instructions. And if we switch to the files, we have STLs for all of the parts that are clearly labeled. When you import these, Adam has taken the time to make sure they're correctly oriented, and they don't need any support either. PETG or something else with a little bit of flex is recommended, and you're going to be printing the components in pairs, as each size has a housing as well as a drawer. You need to flex the housing outward to be able to insert the drawers, but then they should snap into place, and the whole thing should stay pretty secure. What I like about these is that they open up, but they can also lean forward so you can see more easily inside the drawer. And this compares favourably to the cheap part drawers I'm already using. You can also open those up, but you need to teeter them in just the right place, otherwise they'll fall out and you'll lose your hardware all over the floor. Whereas with these, the locking system will prevent the drawer from coming completely out and spilling your parts. The next thing to know about this design is that the system is modular. We can see on the top, bottom and sides there's a dovetail pattern, so you can slot these together. For me they're a fraction loose, but that's only when there's 2 touching each other. As soon as you add a third or more, everything tightens up nicely. This is completely open source, with step files for all of the parts, so making changes is straightforward if you want to. As shown on the printables render, you can build these up to be quite a large system. I personally set up 2 different sets, the first of which 3 wide and 5 units high, roughly the size of an A4 piece of paper, and then a second smaller one with reversed colours that I'll use to show off another perk. All of my existing parts drawers have gaps at the top. This system, however, when shut up, is completely sealed at the top, back and sides. That means is if the whole unit is tipped on its back, there is 0 chance of any parts coming out. Because of this, I'm going to use them with my race car, using them as portable storage for spare nuts and bolts. I know that I can just tip these on the back in the car, and everything will be in the right place when I arrive at the other end. When you make these yourself, you can color code them however you like. We can also integrate labels instead of using paper ones. Most slicers these days have great to use built-in text tools, and that means we can emboss into the surface a much more robust and permanent label for the parts that are going to be contained within. Alternatively, you can print in names or symbols to suit whatever your application is. Each of the outer sections have a countersunk hole at the back where a screw can go through and secure into the wall or another panel. To make mounting more flexible, we have additional pieces like this desk mount. This has 2 screw holes that will go into the underside of a desk before the rest of the system slides into the bottom dovetails. This means you can hang some storage units from the underside of a shelf if that's what you prefer. Instead for me, I cut a piece of plywood and screwed the housings onto the back of it. And that gave me a neat and strong result ready to take on the road. Let's move on with this ergonomic delta table by sdaendi. This is an adjustable work platform with flexible arms. This one's easy to put together, only needing springs or rubber bands, but the 3D printing scales up with bed adhesion issues and support material. The first thing to note is that some of the parts will import in the wrong orientation, so you'll need to fix them the correct way to the bed. I initially printed these legs on their ends, but all that did was cook some spaghetti. A safer orientation is to lay the legs flat and add support material into the ends, and just pray that these unsupported bridges in the middle don't end up being a mess. There's no way to avoid support material on these cantilevered connectors for the base. And the same for these little flex arm holders, where the support needs to be really clean to make sure the spherical shape is retained. And then finally, we have these little flexible arm pieces. You're going to need multiples of these, and you can keep printing extra until the arm is the length you want. There's no escaping that there'll be plenty of post-printing cleanup to remove support material, clean up those unsupported bridges, and file down those connectors flat until they can fit snugly without splitting open the part. Only then can you flip the part over and use a mallet to knock in the locking knobs. These ratcheting trolleys are a nice design, but they can be fiddly to assemble. I initially tried using a rubber band just as the instructions stated, but I found there wasn't enough grip in the ratchet to stop them sliding without permission. So instead, I substituted some small compression springs. This was harder to assemble, but the end result was much stronger. And this gave a really nice positive action to the mechanism. The rest of the assembly is a lot more straightforward. Each of the individual links just snap together, and then each arm goes into the little cutout on the side of the table before sliding around into position. A little bit of grease and the use of a table makes this a lot easier. Now there are parts that you can optionally use to avoid the need for rubber bands and springs. And this is how I originally built the table. But after playing with it, I discovered that the range of motion was impacted by this printed spring fouling on the underside of the table. So I printed the version that takes either tension springs or rubber bands. These just pull outwards and then snap onto the knobs, and the springs have enough clearance to allow full range of motion. This part of the design now works great, going up and down to suit whatever height the user or project needs. The other problem I've had is with the stiffness of the flexible arms, and when I first put this together, they were definitely stiff enough to hold things in place. But as time's gone on, they've worn and lost friction between the individual links, making them a lot saggier. They're still usable, but I'll probably do a reprint, artificially bumping up the flow rate just to get these links a little bit tighter. Overall, I like the design, and with a little bit of tweaking, I think it can be quite a good companion for those small and fiddly projects where you just don't have enough hands. I've been chipping away at this video for a while now, therefore this next one is in its next version, and it has been featured in a video by Adam Savage. But I've still included it because it is such a banger. So the project is the 7-segment counter by Flower 3D, and this is available in single digit as well as double digit. Version 3 is now available, but the process for version 2 should be pretty similar. This is a sophisticated design, but that doesn't mean it's hard to build, and it's a great educational source for learning about cams and springs. Honestly, this design is a masterpiece, and the way it's been released makes life so easy for anyone building it. This includes a detailed guide video going step by step through the assembly, and detailed instructions for exactly what you need to print and how many of each. There are quite a few parts to print here, and none of them are particularly difficult apart from their need to be small and precise. You'll also need to pay attention to the specified colours for contrast. Now assembly for this was pretty much a joy, and I got my 12-year-old son to help me build it. We were able to watch the video, pause it, and then complete that specific step. As you can see, all of the small parts are nicely labelled, which makes matching them up quite trivial. The only additional hardware required was a large rubber band, and I didn't have the exact one specified, but this one seemed to be close enough to do the job fine. And I literally mean the only additional hardware, because even the screws for assembly are 3D printed using 3D printed threads. At first I thought it wasn't working, but it does work best when it's sitting the right way up, because that center segment needs gravity to pull it down. I also noticed it was sticky when switching to the number 1. You would push the button on top, but it would seem to partially jam, and no amount of banging or reorienting would fix it. Maybe updates have made this redundant now, but at the time this was a lifesaver, a remixed KMA1 by Parco. This was a really quick print, and the subtle change was super effective. The mechanism was now perfect transitioning to number 1, except I had another problem, that horizontal segment wasn't falling down with gravity. A quick teardown revealed that there was a little bit of rotational flex with each segment, and this created overlap with the center segment, which jammed it from each side. I fixed this the quickest way possible, by snipping the very corners of each segment. This removed any chance of collisions, and I put a little bit of grease in between these two pieces just to help with smooth motion. Each time you push down on the button, it has a really satisfying mechanical clunk, and it's worth printing this project just to experience that. And if you print version 3, a lot of these minor issues that I encountered should be fixed. Our next project is this motorized V-twin engine, but really it's a lot more than that. On the Bambu Lab website, if we come to Maker World and then Maker Supply, we have a whole bunch of projects to choose from that are mostly listed underneath model kits. The concept for all of these is simple. You 3D print all of your own parts and assemble, and what you're buying here is any hardware and electronics required. For instance, for this Wankel rotary engine, the required parts are a motor and some fasteners. And for any of these that you're interested in, go to the individual page, scroll down, and there should be an animation or video showing it in action. There's a really nice and wide range of projects on offer here. Some are cheap and simple, and some, like this rotating marble rung with lamp, is absolutely incredible. I've covered a few of these projects before, including this jet engine turbine kit and this Bluetooth wireless mouse, a working product that I still regularly use. Now back to our V-twin engine, this is definitely a step up from what we've done so far, with many parts, including support material, and all of those parts requiring a fairly complex assembly. Additional hardware is made easy, however. For the very reasonable price of US $11, we get the motor, a USB connector, some springs, magnets, and other fasteners. If you need to, you can scan the QR code on the box to head to MakerWorld to download the printed parts. And for me at least, I would warn against using any pre-made profiles, because although this did offer the convenience of having all of the parts downloaded in one go, some of the profiles didn't have the colors assigned as they needed to be, but worst of all, the print quality was the worst I've ever had on this machine, with gaps in the extrusions, poor part cooling, poor seams, and Z-banding that I've never seen before or after. Oh, and some of the parts were weak, snapped, and needed reprints. So I would say slice with the usual settings that work for you. After printing, you're going to have a large amount of support material that needs removal. And once all of your prep is complete, you can open up the hardware kit ready for assembly. A step-by-step instructional video makes this somewhat straightforward. Just keep in mind there's quite a lot of small parts and quite a lot of steps, so put aside a good amount of time. Overall, I found this part of the process enjoyable. Including some filming, I think it took me somewhere around 2 hours to complete my assembly. So let's plug her into a power bank and see how the finished product works. The first thing to notice is that we have a series of removable panels so we can better see the inner workings of the engine. Some of them are magnetic and simply pull off, whereas others, like this heatsink pieces, flex and then snap out of place. This gives us an unobstructed view of the push rods, rockers and valve springs in the head, the pistons going up and down in the bores, from the right angle the valves and crank, as well as the motors and gears that drive the crank. It's really satisfying to watch this now that it's done, and it's a great trinket to sit on anyone's desk. Our last two objects are paid models, and unfortunately there are some gaps in the documentation, which I'll try to address. As a Formula 1 tragic, this 1988 Formula Racer by STLLABs was a no-brainer. This is a large model of the McLaren MP44, one of the most dominant F1 cars of all time that took Senna to his first title. This one is a paid model, coming in at just over US $9. No additional hardware is required beyond superglue, so all of the work for this one goes into the 3D printing which is involved, and the assembly which is made harder with some tricky sections. And if you like other type of cars, there's quite a range available on their store page. For your money, you get a nice set of folders with the STLs arranged inside. For instance, the cockpit pieces, and all of the components that make up the engine, gearbox and cooling system. We also have a fairly detailed assembly guide that takes you through step by step. There are some bits missing, however, more on that later. A lot of these components are quite unusual and need an experienced hand in placing support material. You certainly don't want to be attempting this project unless you have all of those settings dialed in your slicer. Another problem is that a lot of these small parts don't really have a natural orientation for placing flat on the bed. We can see if we slice this one, it's only going to touch on the ends, and we're going to have a large unsupported bridge in the middle, which is going to get knocked off and fail. So I actually had to print a bunch of these components by themselves at strange angles with support just to make sure they wouldn't get knocked off. Yet another problem is that although pictured as a dual color print in the shop, all of the bodywork STLs provided are only one color. So if you want to recreate that classic livery from the 80s, you're going to need to paint it by hand yourself, which took me quite a lot of time to get right. Now frustratingly, I have a series of 3MF files with everything painted and ready to go, but since this is a paid model, I just can't share it with you. And one more reason that this is hard to print is that the tires are in TPU, but they need support material in several places. And since TPU bonds very well to itself, ideally you're going to want a different type of filament to act as a support or the interface. I use PLA as the support for TPU, and this worked wonderfully well, although not everyone will have access to the right type of machine. Once you're done printing, there will be a lot of support material to remove. It really does add up. Here's most of what I needed to print this project. Following that, there'll still be some cleanup where you'll need to file or use a blade to make sure all of the mating edges are nice and clean. Just when you think you're up to assembly, there's actually a little bit more printing to do, because those connecting rods that you see me putting glue on aren't actually included in the STLs. Instead, we have some vague instructions about 8mm rods that we need to create ourselves, but very frustratingly, the actual length that you need to make them is never properly specified. The various bores on the model are all different depths, so what you'll need to do is measure the depth of each connection and add these values together to know how long to print the rod. And let me warn you too that the specified 8mm diameter is simply too big, so you'll need to have some trial and error to find the exact size that fits your model. Apart from that, this part of the assembly is quite straightforward. Simply apply glue and slot the components into place, they'll sit nice and flat and their orientation is obvious. Things unfortunately get a lot harder once we get to the suspension. The illustration in the instructions is very stylized rather than labeling the parts carefully, and there's some vague bumps and cutouts, which means the parts don't actually slot together properly. So it ends up being an awkward jigsaw puzzle where you're trying to match up components that won't sit in place and definitely won't stay in place while you wait for glue to dry. After failing miserably with 2-minute epoxy, I switched to cheap superglue with an instant spray-on activator. This means I could glue a few components at a time in small batches, carefully placing them into position, adding some superglue, and then spraying on the activator to set the glue instantly. This did leave some frosting on the model, but without a purpose jig from the designer to hold everything in place, I couldn't think of another way to achieve this, so that's what I was stuck with. After repeating this process at the rear, which had even smaller and fiddlier components, the hardest part of the assembly was done. I could now slide on the wheels, gluing on the center nut to hold them permanently in place, and move on to finishing by installing the bodywork. Only the rear wing of these pieces gets glued, and then the rest of the bodywork simply rests on top. Now this is quite convenient, but it's not exactly secure, and I feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity to not have some sort of magnetic system to hold the bodywork panels in place. This would help control the panel gaps and help secure the front wing, which currently falls off if you look at it the wrong way. The process of making this has been quite frustrating, and as you can see, that suspension ended up being pretty wonky. But despite this, now that it's done, I'm glad that I made it. The overall size is quite large, which makes it impressive, and there's so many fine details that have been modelled beautifully. There's no doubt the modeler really is skilled with the way they've created this form. I just wish the same attention to detail went into the user experience of building it. And I could say similar things about our final project, the fee-based 3D printed 4-string bass guitar. This one is by Filatone Instruments and will cost you just under $14 US. This one is a lot easier to 3D print, with the main obstacle being large parts, but the assembly is a lot more advanced, mainly because of things specific to a guitar like fretting. There's a few different pieces of hardware required, but they are easy to track down. Now previously I featured the Caterin Mark II guitar, also by Filatone, and my wonderfully talented friend Drew was able to verify that it played pretty well. For your money, you get a download that contains all of the STLs, however this is a little confusing. We have one folder labelled FeeBass, and it appears to have most of the parts, but then there's seemingly identical copies of the same parts in other folders with different names. It's just a bit confusing. We also have a very nicely presented instruction manual that labels all of the parts and tells you the quantities for each. However, unlike the Caterin, there's no notes on print settings, and there's no suggestions for which parts need to be what color if you're going for a two-tone design. To get around this, I went back to the store page and tried to match up the files so I knew what color to do each. Also a pain was some of the quantities being incorrect for the small parts, meaning I had to pause and print more. The links to all of the hardware you require is in the instructions. However, some of the items are no longer available, so you will need to shop around to find equivalents. One aspect that's greatly improved from the other guitar is that you can buy the electronics as a pre-assembled kit, and later on this will greatly reduce complexity. All up, you could build this for under $100 US. My last note is that there's a 2020 extrusion that needs to be cut to 900mm in length. Make sure it's a 3D printer style V-roller rather than generic or it won't fit. Apart from making sure you color code, most of the printing for this is pretty straightforward. Some of the parts are large and will take a while, and there's plenty of support needed, particularly for these bosses that slide inside the 2020. I printed everything in PETG and then got to work removing all of the support material. Some of the supported edges also needed a little bit of tidying up so they could slide properly into the extrusion. The assembly properly begins with the electric pickups being screwed into place, followed by parts of the outer frame being pressed into position, but these didn't sit quite as nicely as the parts for the Caterham Mark II did. It's not a deal breaker, but it just doesn't leave the impression that the same care was put into the design. The basic pattern of the assembly is that you slide parts down the 2020 extrusion until they line up, and then hold them together with some self-tapping screws. These parts are a nice snug fit inside the extrusion, which I think is a good thing, as when they're screwed into position, everything feels pretty solid. Pretty early on, the rest of the electronics are fitted, with pretty much all of them going into this single panel, with the final piece being this ground wire that sits underneath this piece of threading. I must say, the fitment for the neck pieces is rather tight, and like me, you'll probably need the persuasion of some sort of mallet. So I was pretty frustrated when I got the last piece into position and found that the extrusion was slightly too long, despite being exactly 900mm. Not wanting to completely disassemble the guitar, I set up the table saw to remove approximately 5mm from the end, and unfortunately removed about 9mm instead. To fix this, I modelled up a simple spacer, which I think filled the gap nicely, but this led me to my next frustration. The string tensioning parts, as ordered from the link, were too big to fit through the printed component. The widest part was around 14mm in diameter, but when I measured the STL, the opening was only 13.6, so it was never going to fit. Begrudgingly, I bought the cheapest 14mm drill bit I could, and opened up the bores to suit. I really hope this geometry is fixed in a future revision of the part. Probably the most daunting part of the assembly, if you've never done it before, is adding the fret wire. They come in lengths that are far too long, and you need to put them into position and then cut them to length. There's specialist tools for this, but a set of pincers or pliers will also get the job done, with nickel frets at least. After they're all in, you then need to come back and file the edges to add an ergonomic bevel. This combined with some sanding and polishing means you won't cut your hands as you're playing the instrument. To finish up, we need to install our strings and then tune the guitar. These slide into the bridge, which is on the far end, are guided underneath the magnetic pickups, and then are trimmed to length and wrapped around the tuning pegs. To help with these specific steps, I've got a bunch of resources and videos linked in this video description, and that includes a link to the Guitar Tuner app, which I use to tune the strings once tensioned. So that's the finished guitar, and personally I think it looks incredible. As for how it plays, I am not qualified to test it. So let me introduce Holly, an old teacher friend of mine who plays the bass in a band, except she decided she was too cool, so she organised a star student. So many thanks to Cordell for giving this a go and giving us some feedback.
Plays really well, really light, handles well, the strings feel really nice. A little bit of buzzing along the lower notes, especially, and the intonation along the top, a little bit out, but I mean, for what it is, it plays really well.
Does the pickups get in your way?
It sort of reminds me of the vintage 60s basses. It can get in your way sometimes, especially when you're trying to do some complex slapping. But I mean, you just sort of rest your hand on it and you just play around it. It doesn't really make that much of a difference.
So cool looking and definitely good enough for me to try and learn on. And my first task is to master complex slapping. And that is 6 more projects that you can make with your 3D printer. And each of them do have some challenges, but I still think they're worth making overall. I'd love to make a part 3, so let me know in the comments your suggestions for future projects I can tackle. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy 3D printing. G'day, it's Michael again. If you liked the video, then please click like. If you want to see more content like this in future, click subscribe and make sure you click on the bell to receive every notification. If you really want to support the channel and see exclusive content, become a patron. Visit my Patreon page. See you next time.